In 1893, 65 million people descended on Chicago for the greatest spectacle in American history, the world's Columbian Exposition. A city of white palaces, electric lights, the first Ferris wheel, and 1 block away, a man was murdering his guests. Or was he? The story you've been told about H.H. Holmes is one of the most repeated and most distorted true crime narratives in American history. A monster, a castle of death, 200 victims. The truth is more disturbing. Not because it's worse, because it's more human. Facts are facts, but are they? His real name was Herman Webster Mudgett, born the 16th of May, 1861, in Gilmanton, New Hampshire, the son of a Methodist farmer. By all accounts, an intelligent child. Unsettling, some said. There are stories of childhood cruelty to animals, the kind of biographical detail that gets retrofitted onto monsters after the fact. Whether they re-accurate is anyone's guess. What is documented? Mudgett was extraordinarily gifted. He talked his way into the University of Michigan Medical School. He graduated with a medical degree in 1884. He was 23 years old and already using at least 2 false identities. He would spend the rest of his life collecting them. In 1886, Mudgett arrived in Chicago under the name Henry Howard Holmes. He charmed his way into a job at a drugstore in the Englewood neighborhood, run by an elderly widow named Elizabeth Holton. Within 2 years, Mrs. Holton had disappeared. Holmes owned the pharmacy. He bought a lot across the street and began construction on what newspapers would later call the Murder Castle. A 3-story mixed-use building, pharmacy and shops on the ground floor, a hotel above, Holmes' office and private quarters at the top. He designed it himself. He hired contractors, fired them before they finished, hired new ones. No single crew ever saw the complete plans. No single person ever understood what the building actually contained. What investigators found after his arrest: rooms with no windows and doors that locked only from the outside. Gas pipes connected to a control valve in Holmes' bedroom. A chute leading from the upper floors directly to the basement. A dissection table, 2 furnaces large enough for a human body. A vat of acid. A vat of quicklime. An articulated skeleton, cleaned, jointed, sold to a medical school. The castle was real. What happened inside it is where the story gets complicated. In 1886, Mudgett arrived in Chicago under the name Henry Howard Holmes. He charmed his way into a job at a drugstore in the Englewood neighborhood, run by an elderly widow named Elizabeth Holton. Within 2 years, Mrs. Holton had disappeared. Holmes owned the pharmacy. He bought a lot across the street and began construction on what newspapers would later call the Murder Castle. A 3-story mixed-use building, pharmacy and shops on the ground floor, a hotel above, Holmes' office and private quarters at the top. He designed it himself. He hired contractors, fired them before they finished, hired new ones. No single crew ever saw the complete plans. No single person ever understood what the building actually contained. What investigators found after his arrest: rooms with no windows and doors that locked only from the outside. Gas pipes connected to a control valve in Holmes' bedroom. A chute leading from the upper floors directly to the basement. A dissection table, 2 furnaces large enough for a human body. A vat of acid. A vat of quicklime. An articulated skeleton, cleaned, jointed, sold to a medical school. The castle was real. What happened inside it is where the story gets complicated. On May 1st, 1893, President Grover Cleveland pressed a golden telegraph key, and the world's Columbian Exposition opened in Chicago. 200 buildings, 65 million visitors over 6 months. The largest World's Fair in history. It introduced the Ferris wheel, the dishwasher, juicy fruit gum, and Cracker Jack to the world. It also flooded Chicago with exactly the kind of people Holmes preyed on. Young women from small towns, arriving alone to find work. Men with insurance policies. Business partners who could be persuaded to sign over assets. Holmes was a gifted manipulator in an era before background checks, before photographs traveled faster than a man could, before any central record of who he was or what he'd done. He wasn't hunting randomly. He was running a business. The World's Fair was his market. Here is where the myth and the reality split. The myth. Holmes murdered upwards of 200 people in the castle, a systematic killing machine. The first American serial killer operating an industrialized slaughterhouse. The reality. Holmes confessed to 27 murders in 1896, shortly before his execution. Investigators have been able to confirm, through physical evidence and records, somewhere between 9 and 27. The 2 to 100 figure comes from newspaper sensationalism in 1895. When reporters competed to outdo each other's body counts without evidence, it was repeated until it became fact. Here is what is documented and confirmed. Holmes murdered Benjamin Pitezel, his business associate, to collect on a life insurance policy, and then, extraordinarily, murdered 3 of Pitezel's own children, while their mother believed them to be safely in Holmes's care. Minnie Williams, her sister Nanny, his wife Myrta, who survived because she didn't know enough to be a threat. He was a con man who escalated to murder when the con required it. Not a sadist building a death palace for pleasure. A cold, methodical fraud who killed to cover his tracks and collect money. That distinction matters, because a sadist is a monster from another world. What Holmes actually was is something we understand, and that's far more unsettling. The trap did not close on HH Holmes because of his infamous murder castle, but because of a simple, cold-blooded insurance policy. Holmes convinced his associate, Benjamin Pitezel, to fake his own death for a massive payout. It was supposed to be a victimless ruse, a clever way to swindle the system. But greed soon consumed the doctor. Holmes turned the deception into a real murder, ending Pitezel's life to claim every cent for himself. The shadow of the gallows began to stretch. With the money pocketed, Holmes began a horrific game of cat and mouse. He lied to Pitezel's grieving widow, claiming her husband was alive and waiting for her. He convinced her to let him take 3 of her children, promising they were traveling to meet their father. In reality, Holmes was dragging the terrified children across the country. From city to city, he moved like a ghost, murdering them one by one in cold, calculated silence. He believed he was untouchable, leaving a trail of blood hidden beneath hotel registers and false names. Enter Frank Geyer, a relentless Pinkerton detective who refused to let the trail go cold. For months, Geyer retraced Holmes's path through the United States and into Canada. He was a man possessed, combing through hundreds of hotel logs and grilling suspicious landlords. Every city revealed a new layer of Holmes's deception. The search reached its grim conclusion in Toronto. At a nondescript rented house, Geyer felt the heavy weight of dread as he entered the cellar. With a shovel in hand, he broke into the cold earth of the basement. There, the horrific truth was unearthed as he found the remains of the innocent children. The dots were finally connected. While Holmes sat in a Texas jail for a minor horse theft, he was blissfully unaware that his reign of terror had been exposed by Geyer's iron will. The predator had finally become the prey. The law moved with swift, iron justice. Holmes was extradited and found guilty of Pitezel's murder. On the 7th of May, 1896, at Moyamensing Prison, the end finally arrived. As the heavy trapdoor fell, the 34-year-old killer faced the ultimate consequence of his long, calculated trail of blood and deception. Three days after Holmes was arrested, the murder castle caught fire. The origin of the fire was never determined. The upper floors, homes, private rooms, the gas pipe chambers, the space where whatever happened, were destroyed. Make of that what you will. The building was repaired and repurposed several times. A post office now stands on the site. There is no marker. Most people walking past it have no idea. The castle is gone. The bodies that can be confirmed are documented. The 200 that can remain in newspaper archives and true crime podcasts, unverified, repeated. The myth of H.H. Holmes is the story of a monster so inhuman that we can safely look at him from a distance. 200 victims. A mechanical killing palace. Something that couldn't happen now because it couldn't happen in a recognizable world. The truth of H. Holmes is the story of a charming, intelligent man who learned early that people would believe whatever he told them, who built a business on fraud, who escalated to murder when fraud wasn't enough, who killed children not out of sadism, but because they were inconvenient witnesses. That's not a monster from another world. That's a man who made a series of choices, each one enabled by the people around him who found him charming, persuasive, and trustworthy. He couldn't have done it without them. Holmes was hanged on May 7th, 1896. At his request, his coffin was buried 10 feet deep and encased in solid concrete. He knew what men were capable of, because he had done it himself. He had robbed graves. He had dissected bodies. He had sold skeletons to medical schools. He didn't want the same done to him. 130 years later, we still can't agree on how many people he killed, or why, or what it means.
But he knew exactly what he was. I am ObscuraCast. I go where the story is.
And I'll tell you what I actually think, even when it's not what you want to hear. Subscribe.